Get started now. So thank you to everyone online and in the room for coming along to our seminar this evening. And tonight our speaker is Deirdre Sullivan. So just to give some background, as a lecturer in archaeology at Leicester's Department of Archaeology, and then part of the establishment of the School of Archaeology and Ancient History, Deirdre has been involved in leading, teaching and designing courses at all levels, both campus-based and distance learning. Having previously worked as a field archaeologist and as a post-excavation researcher at Durham and St Andrews, Deirdre has extensive experience working with contract archaeologists and has acted as a formal advisor to ULAS on many major medieval projects in Leicester. Her research areas span across the archaeology of medieval monasticism in the British Isles, studying priories as urban places, urban archaeology, gender and representation, contemporary practice of religion, and the role of archaeology within cultural heritage. So can we please all give Deirdre a warm welcome.
Right, I'm very aware of my technological incapacity in giving this lecture. No way would it be managed without the support team. I think we're brilliant to have kept these hybrid sessions going, because I think having been able to use them at a distance as well as local, I think it creates a very good kind of, I was going to say, community of place and also a remote community. Now, I chewed about it a bit for quite a while before I decided on the title for this lecture, and I'm still not sure that I've got it right, but many of you will spot the reference, A Handmaid's Tale, not simply to Margaret Atwood's book or the TV series, but also to the role that archaeology is often assigned in relation to the discipline of history, the handmaid of history, something that every archaeologist seems obliged to deny as being what they actually do. In this sense, I'm not actually casting archaeology as the handmaid, but rather the idea of place as something that supports other things. And here I'm picking on, or I'm identifying with, the Metanarratives of the Reformation. Now, I know a little bit about the Reformation, but the amount that can be known is absolutely vast. So I'm assuming that you all kind of know, if you like, well, we all know what happened, but obviously the questions are why and where, and also the different discourses that are embedded in both academic study of the Reformation and also, very importantly, popular understanding, not simply of the past, but of its role in the present. So here are just, probably not all, but a good range of meta-narratives that are linked to the theme of the Reformation. Perhaps the most dominating one is the idea that it represents the birth of modern Europe. What is involved in that birth can be quarried again within itself for different themes. A very important theme is that of religious identity and sectarianism. I use the word sectarianism advisedly because I think that a lot of things that are sometimes cast as religion are in fact primarily about sectarianism, in which religion is itself an ingredient rather than the other way around. But that's maybe a personal perspective that I have. But certainly those themes are very important in studying the Reformation. Another huge theme is the secularization of the political sphere. So the idea that religion was somehow taken out of the political sphere, which isn't true, but that it was removed to a much greater extent than had been present in the Middle Ages. There's also the idea that materialism and materiality became much more defining as concepts in how people did things and what they aspired to do. And particularly, we could see that a lot of the values that are placed on the Middle Ages derive from a much more materialist approach that really kicks off in the 16th and 17th century. Now, I'm saying these are themes that have been explored, not necessarily that I or anybody agrees with them or the extent to which they are important. Another important theme that archaeologists have picked up on fairly effectively is the changing discourse of poverty and wealth. And one thing that you notice in a lot of studies of many periods is that wealth is wealth is what you study and poverty is what you ignore. And part of that is a taphonomic process to do with the way evidence survives. But in fact, it's also to do with what might be seen as the ethics of poverty and how poverty was viewed in the post-medieval period, or perhaps more excruciatingly in the most recent periods. And I put here a very well-known engraving. I don't know if you can see it very well. It's a bit faint, but it's a very famous one, done by Pugin, the architect Pugin, who was himself a convert to Roman Catholicism and a lover of all things medieval, heavily involved in the Gothic revival and the architect of many famous buildings in that style. But Pugin's theme, basically, within his architecture, his neo-Gothic architecture, Gothic revival style, is that the Middle Ages were a better place than modern times. And one of the best-known illustrations that he's produced is this famous identification of the workhouse as a desperate place, a terrible place, without kindness, with destitution punished for itself, with terrible treatment of the dead. He sees the pauper being carted away anonymously. He sees the cruelty of the people who ran the workhouse and the terrible food. Can't really see that from the image, but that's certainly what he's looking at, and the cruel way in which inmates of workhouses, who are not themselves officially marked as criminal, were treated. And he contrasts this with the Middle Ages, which he sees as a time of charity and kindness, when everybody was looked after. They were, if they were old and dying and ill, they would have comfortable beds to look after them. They would have nice accommodation in special places that were, designed for them, in almshouses and so forth. They would have a dignified funeral with their fellow Christians beside them at the end. And this is how he actually, draws a strong contrast between the 19th century, when he was working, and his vision of the Middle Ages. So these are all meta-narratives, big themes, big stories, into which individual projects and researches, etc., may be seen to fit. And I think that the first question that I really want to ask is, or to pose, and I don't necessarily think I'll have answered it by the end, is how do places fit into these meta-narratives? Where do they belong? Do they actually belong there at all? I think we can find that some of the narratives do actually exclude sense of place from what they're up to. Now, I'm not obviously going to explore all of these themes here at all today, but just to go back to perhaps one of the most basic questions that you often get asked, and that often arises in, I would say, typically, Boxing Day discussions, when people are a little bit overfed, a little bit hungover, and they want to ask one of the great questions of time and place. And if they've got an historical interest or they've been reading something recently, they want to say, well, Deirdre, was the Reformation a good thing or a bad thing? Now, the only tactical, safe answer is that it was both, an answer that I recommend if you're ever asked the same question. But obviously, what was good about it and what was bad about it might be matters for dispute. Now, an early comment on the Reformation, attributed to the Pope of the time, Clement VII, is that it could be discarded quickly as just a quarrel among friars. He wasn't very politically astute. He wasn't politically astute in a couple of other ways as well, but certainly he had no idea when it all kicked off what was going to happen. Now, famously, the Reformation has a sort of a start date. I think it's the 30th of October, 1517, it's definitely 1517, when the Austin friar, Martin Luther, first friar in the case, nailed a set of 95 objections to current readings of, well, particularly actually about practice, particularly relating to the use of indulgences by the church to raise money. Now, the indulgence was something that Luther thought was both morally and philosophically completely untenable. The idea that you could simply purchase vouchers with money which you happen to have in order to get remission from your time in purgatory, or even a total get out of hell free card if you got a plenary indulgence. And that was at the core of his objection to the way the church in the early 16th century was raising resources, in this particular case, to build St. Peter's in Rome. It was part of a European-wide levy among local rural churches, as well as greater ones, to try and raise cash that would go to the papacy to fund the building of this magnificent new centre for Christendom. A couple of centuries down the line, I have another comment which I wheel out every so often. Thomas Wright, who drafted this, is a very well-known early 19th century antiquary. He published lots of books, including many editions, often deemed now to be a bit uncritical, but very energetically published for his time. And this is from a volume that was published in one of the volumes of the Camden Society. And he asserts that the greatest blessing conferred by Providence among this country since the first introduction of the Christian religion was the dissolution of the monasteries, the suppression of the monasteries. The great cause of the Reformation has been but ill-served by concealing the depravities of the system which it overthrew. And again, we can see this as a highly directional, politicized and damning indictment of medieval Christianity and its practices. So we have a minimum, and I say not actually, didn't really get the message type comment from the Pope, and an all-embracing statement that the dissolution of the monasteries was completely a good thing. Now, there's been an enormous volume of academic scholarship about the Reformation. I was reminded of Simon's presentation last week when he showed the volumes that he had on Dura Europos. I can't imagine what a library of Reformation stuff would look like. And I can assure you I haven't read all of it, or even very much of it at all, because that just wouldn't be possible in a lifetime. But I thought we could look at a couple of sort of pioneering statements about this, where the genesis of the Reformation and its impact has been taken up by scholars in, I suppose we could call them, other disciplines. First is Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And the second, which follows on from that very much, is R.H. Tawney's Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Now, these are essentially philosophical studies rather than straight historical ones. But they argued that it was the ethic of Protestantism, more explicitly Calvinist religious thinking, which drove the surge of economic and social change in the 16th century. Capitalist prosperity was seen to thrive on belief in predestination, the merits of hard work, and individual enterprise and frugality. This is any echo in some of the stuff you're picking up from politicians. I'm sure it will have some resonance in the 21st century. Now, if we move on to, these were very influential. They're stuff that, you know, particularly people who aren't actually historians wheel out as incorporating fundamental social truths, sometimes even still. But since then, there's a vast array of different kinds of studies which relate sometimes to grand themes, sometimes trying to establish particular agency or agencies, and some, not so many, the ones that I read, actually also adopting a philosophical tone. Now, I'm sure you all have heard of Hilary Mantel's work. She passed away, sadly, a month or so ago, and she wrote 3 best-selling novels, 2 of which were Booker Prize winners. Does everybody? No, not everybody. Some of you will have read this. Pause up. Yes, right. Well, her novel, or her novels, are bound to be extremely influential in how people read the Reformation in their aftermath. Because they're very good books. They're very persuasive. They explore the actions and sentiments of a very powerful and interesting individual. She really kind of gets inside his skin, and she carries his story through in a very, very effective way over what must be going on for how many thousand words? An awful lot of words. But they're a very good read, and I'm sure that if we take that as, you know, from now looking backwards, we can see how she has reframed an historical figure who certainly Reformation a bad thing side would have been seen as a major villain, Thomas Cromwell, and turns him into, if not exactly a hero, because the book is too good to be straight down the aisle, heroes and villains kind of stuff, but shows that his role and his agency is imbued with much more sincerity and complexity than the simply ambition and greed agenda that is often thrust upon him. But Thomas Cromwell aside, there's also another book which came out, I think, last year. Don't call it Thomas Cromwell Alive, which is a biography of Cromwell. I don't think the third volume of Hilary Mantel's book had come out when this came out, but this is based on, again, many years of study of Cromwell using his own primary sources. Now, this particular figure has enormous agency in the English Reformation because he's seen as the doer, the person who delivered, and he delivered things pretty rapidly, very efficiently, and got his head cut off for his pains. But there are many other interesting studies that approach the Reformation from other directions. Of this, the one that I'd say has certainly had the most influence on me is Eamon Duffy's Stripping of the Altars, a very engaged book with material culture, which looks at religious practice, particularly local village religious practice in the decades before and after the Reformation, and maps out how this changes. But he also looks at, particularly at the values that local ordinary people put on these activities. So they were very distressed that they lost lots of Saint Days feasts, for example. All those days off being cancelled, you know, the public bank holidays being binned. It could be said, although I don't actually think this was the reason, it could be said in the spirit of making people more hardworking and not having so much leisure time. That maybe came a bit later. Anyhow, this is a very powerful book, particularly from an archaeological perspective, because it looks at the bits and bobs of medieval life that survive into the present or that are recorded in documents. Another very good read is Alexandra Walsham's The Reformation of the Landscape. Here she moves away from people and human agency to look much more at the way in which religious beliefs and practices were embedded in particularly the rural landscape, and how, again, these were initially, in some cases, prescribed, but how in some ways they also came back a bit further down the line. Other things there. Another book I certainly think is well worth a read is Greg Walker's Writing Under Tyranny. Greg used to be an English professor here. In fact, he'd still been here. He would have been sacked 2 years ago. Happily for him, he was redeployed in Edinburgh. And this study came out. It's extremely well written, and he's looking at the work of important 16th century writers, both within the reign of Henry VIII and a little bit afterwards, but particularly within the reign of Henry VIII. His starting hypothesis is that Henry was a tyrant, so in the title of the book, and that he was an authoritarian ruler. He became an authoritarian ruler on the back of the power and control that he seized for himself during the Reformation. So the last one I want to point out here, because it is actually a biography of place, even though it's not about the physical place, is The Voices of More Bath. This is a remarkable record by a church warden of the ways in which his budget changed actually in the course of the Reformation, and what money got spent and what money got collected. And it's actually quite a heartbreaking book, because you see all the little pots of money that people had within this very small rural community on Exmoor to keep them going. And there was a lot of communal value placed in these little collections. And the way in which, I hope this isn't having too many echoes in the immediate time, the way in which things were centralized and imposed was very, very rapid. And people are very uncomfortable about it. And we can see a degree of cruelty in the implementation of some of these decisions that were forced on a fairly small local community. So that's just barely scratching the surface of the sorts of things that arise, and why the Reformation is such a huge topic in terms of writing and printing now, as indeed it was in the 16th century. So I'm going to end this little section of my talk with a discussion that I had with my family. It wasn't Boxing Day, it was much more recent than that. WhatsApp exchange in the aftermath of the death of Hilary Mantel. My sister-in-law is a doctor and lives in Dublin. Don't worry, you're not going to get all my family history here. But anyhow, she says Hilary Mantel had a house there in West Cork and wanted to move here after Brexit. Ironically, it was probably the Tudors who sowed the seeds of Brexit. Niamh, my eldest sister. Deirdre, please comment. I am meant to be the expert voice here. Emmeline, Niamh's daughter, my niece. She's actually, no, I'm not going to confess that. She pulls this out of the pan, which I think I had actually missed myself at this point. Kwasi Kwarteng said himself that Brexit was modelled on the English Reformation. So I thought, quarrying into something, loss of Calais, was this the problem? No. He seemed to see that it was again a sort of a statement of the philosophy of Brexit is somehow embodied in the qualities celebrated in the English Reformation. So anyhow, I get back and say quite a lot of things have happened since Tudor times, and then I'm working myself up. Victorian parliamentarians were prone to quarrying past history to justify their own positions as somehow inevitable. Sounds like more of the same. And then I got my little extra bit of knowledge, Chums by Simon Cooper. It came out this year, I think. It's a book looking at the Oxford friendships within the current front bench of the Tory party. It's a very entertaining read. But he puts a much more evidence-based analysis, I'm getting pompous here, that Brexit was hatched in Oxford in the 1980s by some of the folk we know. So again, just to point out that these meta-narratives, whether they're of the Reformation or indeed of any other thing, are very easily quarried and converted to purpose by people who have their own agendas. And often quite blatantly, anomalously as well. I mean, you can deceive yourself about a lot of things, but actually saying that Brexit originates in the Reformation long before, hundreds of years before the European Union had even been formed, does seem to be going back a bit, a bit too deep. Now, again, just to touch on some general points, and again, I'm not going to be digging into these in any great detail, but maybe think about them as we look at the couple of case studies that I'm going to use. We all live, if you like, as we work and study in academia, whether it's archaeology or history of art or whatever you might be doing, we all function at a kind of intersectionality of different discourses. And if you like, you can go down your own, only read the publications of your friends, reinforce them, and come out with, an agreed statement about what was really going on. But much more usually now, you have to actually engage with discourses that are not just your own. So you have to be aware of what's being said and talked about and written and understood in other themes. And I would lump archaeology in here under material culture and art and architecture, probably in both of those places. But there's been a lot of engagement with what objects and things like clothing meant and were understood to mean, as well as the role of economics of production and things like that. There's things that are much more engaged with studies that are much more engaged with symbolic and power. I suppose we could say simply the power that materiality has to frame how people think about things. The dissolution of the monasteries itself is a very good example of that. You've all these ruins being created all over the place and then left to fall down, and that does kind of show you that there's been a big change, that the symbolism of destruction is monumental and manifest under your noses. You can see it everywhere. In literature, just to revert briefly to Greg Walker's work, I think that we ourselves quarry literature, either of the time or of more recent understandings of it. I mean, Shakespeare probably, I'm not discovering this, Shakespeare, probably the most influential writer in English of any or all time, is quarried by every generation for his bon mots and for his understanding of human character and all the rest. And obviously some of his plays also relate to the period of the Reformation. But we see lots of crossovers. Could we draw a fine line, for example, between a political discourse that uses the Reformation to show how power was operated, or would that relate perhaps also to emergent colonial strategies in new colonies, particularly in the New World? Now, I think I can point out, Jose is here and can certainly back me up, the New World wasn't discovered by Protestants. And indeed, the earliest colonial regimes could not have been inspired by the writings of Calvin. He hadn't even written them yet. But there were models of colonialism that were around and in use, many of which actually derive from medieval ideas of colonial goals. So I think that when people say, as some of the more philosophical discourses say, that Protestantism actually underpins everything that is colonial, that really, even at the level of a sweeping meta-narrative, that really is too much. It's not supported by what actually happened. But anyhow, all of these themes interact, and certainly as archaeologists, we have to deal particularly with issues of heritage value. Are these surviving monuments in archaeology, what are they worth, and for whom are they of value? A theme of aesthetic value is something that, I think, being a bit of an old fogey, I would say there isn't enough of that around now. But there's obviously a more serious question there as to whether everything is of value, is everything of equal value? And if not, and in practical terms, obviously, the answer has to be if not, how are things prioritized? Material value, i.e. what the stuff is actually worth, is not something that we tend to engage with very much, but we're probably more engaged with what it cost, which is rather a different thing. So I'm going to move on now just to one last preliminary slide before I go to the case studies. And this is the idea of a biography of place. Biography of place is what actually archaeologists do all the time. They don't necessarily call it that, but it's a very, very simple concept in which you simply say what happened at the place, rather than tell the stories of the people who were there or discuss the geomorphology and sedimentology of what the site is made of. You try to tell the story of the place through what actually survives. And I've done a lot of work on friaries, and I found a very simple model which I used to try and develop these biographies for individual places. And I've just set out here the kind of evidence that I could access in order to do this. And it doesn't make any firm distinction between what is documentary and archaeological and what is historically informed by text and what is informed by what you find in the ground or what survives in standing buildings. But basically, a simple sequence could be worked out for any site, which simply involves what was there before the place, in my case, the friary, was created, who were the founders, and when was the foundation date. That's often known with some precision. The founders are not closed. You can become a founder centuries after the place was founded. You could get access to that status by becoming an important patron, and you would be called a founder. That gave you that, if you like, investment in the prayers and good deeds of the community. We have buildings which tell us about the building materials and whether the precinct was augmented. We have a lot of documentary evidence for that, which comes through piecemeal in the course of the 13th and 14th century. We have records of visits by notable figures. That isn't irrelevant because it tells us how the buildings were used, and also as a result of how these things were calculated, it tells us how many people, how many friars were actually living in the buildings when these visitations occurred, because they forked out a standard donation to support the community. We have records of wills, gifts, benefactions. We have records of the disposal of monuments in churches, how they're set around. We have records of leases, and they become particularly important at the end of the medieval period, because we have the suppression documentation. And in many cases, it is actually at the moment of departure that we find out most about these friaries. And so the documentation that we get when they're closed, which is a fairly narrow window of 9 months between July 1538 and March 1539, we have a lot of documents that are created in the immediate aftermath of the suppression, which again includes the leases into which the properties might have entered. So that tells us what kind of resources they had in terms of income coming into the site. It also indicates the decline, significant decline in the actual monastic population. We have records of the values of the property when it was subsequently sold. There are astonishingly good records in the immediate aftermath of the dissolution of the monasteries for who was actually using the property. It's a very, very rich source. And we then have notes of subsequent use. Leland is a very important figure for the suppression in England because he was travelling around while it was actually going on. And what he doesn't say is in many cases as interesting as what he does. He certainly doesn't make any comment that is a criticism of the dissolution process itself. But there's loads and loads of antiquarian sources, some from the 17th, but more from the 18th century. And obviously there are surviving records of property transactions from those times. And then we have the whole kind of a story that can be built from looking at the place, looking at what has happened to it, and what it looks like now in a conserved environment. So the first place I'm going to look at is a place called Clare Priory in Suffolk. Not a famous site. God, any of you probably haven't, I don't imagine any of you would have been there, wouldn't have heard of it, right? And that kind of fits in with my story. Now, if you look at it, you would at first glance think that that doesn't look very like a medieval building. If you look a bit closely, obviously you can spot the clue in the doorway in the ground floor range, which is a nice 14th century doorway. And this range was the west range of the monastic complex at Clare. Now, Clare is a very special place in terms of its own history because it was the first house founded by for the Austin Friars in Clare. It was founded at a very early stage in the development of the order when they were basically still living a fairly, I wouldn't say hermetic, I think that is right, it's certainly not hermeneutic life, without much collective engagement. They were more like hermits than regular choir friars. But that's a very early stage in the period. But the interesting thing about it, it's next door to a castle, which is the centre of a very, very important medieval lordship, the Honour of Clare. This goes right back to the foundation of the castle there by one of the followers of William. So he was a tenant-in-chief of William the Conqueror. He had very substantial estates, not just in East Anglia, but also in Wales. And one of the family, Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke, otherwise known as Strongbow, probably best known to you as a form of cider, but his strongbow was actually wielded in the conquest of Ireland at the end of the 12th century, the Norman conquest of Ireland. So he was the primary lord or baron which led the invading forces. Anyhow, just to say, this was a very posh location. There were posh people at this castle. And basically what we see with the creation of the friary in the 15th century, sorry, in the 13th century, is a very noble lord having his own kind of personal spiritual support by having his own friary just kind of round the corner, when they were still, as I say, more hermit-like than the mendicant friars that they then became. Now, as you look at it now, as you experience the place, as you go there, the thing that everybody notices, of course, is that it's pink, which you wouldn't expect of a medieval building. In fact, this is a local custom in Suffolk that lots of buildings are painted pink. I'm told that it's supposed to be bull's blood, but that I don't know. It hasn't been heavily heritaged because its history is very, as I say, very singular. At the Reformation, it was closed and passed very quickly to a family called Barnardiston, who owned it throughout the 17th century and into the 18th. Then kins of theirs called the Barkers had the property. And finally, in the 20th century, it went back to a woman who had married a Barnardiston. So it looks as though, although it isn't quite the case, that the same family had more or less had it since it was dissolved in the 16th century. And as a result of that, it's been a residence, a private residence, right into the 1950s. It's never been anything else. And also the documents about the house, it actually has a medieval cartulary, which is very unusual for a friary, surviving. There are other things that survive as part of the, if you like, the household possessions and transfers of land. But anyhow, as a result of that, we know a surprising amount about the 14th and 15th century history of the friary. It was the principal site of the Austin Friars, and in 1953, the same order, actually acquired it and regenerated the friary. So it moved back. A new centre for the Austrian friars in England was created, and this was at the site of the original first foundation place of the friary. It's kind of open to the public. It's not a heritage site. It's a residence for friars and for other people who want to go there on some kind of spiritual or religious purpose. I dread to say it, but our good old chums, the Richard III Society, have a little plaque there in which they commemorate the noble persons who are buried there, who are related to Richard III. So we can see these as celebrities, if you like, and that is something that has been brought out in how the house is represented now. In the ruined church, which we can see on the other side, there's a rather fine, though in this case rather overgrown, medieval, 14th century medieval tomb, which is believed to be that of Joan of Acre, who was a daughter of Edward I, and also of Lionel of Clarence, and both of their spouses. So they were, if you like, well, effectively royalty, although they never inherited the crown, but they were members of the royal family, and they ended up being buried there. And that's part of that to do with the rich association with the castle. Now, here, if we think about the meaning of place and how place might contribute to the grand narrative, I kind of contemplate this and think, well, first of all, it's not something that's been showcased. It hasn't been marketed or merchandised in any way as a place other than this little gesture from the Richard III Society, who are pointing to the fact that some noble kinsfolk of Richard were buried in the friary. It has a very obvious function related to its original function. It's a very pleasant place. Nobody would throw you away, you know, if you went there. I'm sure you'd be welcome to visit. Other buildings survive. This is the infirmary, which was used as a church when the friars came back in the 1950s. But since then they've done something else. In the meantime, this little range, which has only really been properly identified, I think, in fairly recent years, is possibly one of the earliest bits of monastic architecture around. It's very of timber architecture around. It's very simple range, timber framed range. You can see it looks like a timber frame building fairly clearly, although there's one decorated window in the back wall there. But you can see that inside it's a narrow timber framed range. We don't know what it would have been used for originally, probably some kind of kitchen purpose, and it's now actually a little chapel. But this is what the friars have been up to. They now have a parish function, and as a result of that, they decided that they needed a new church for a range of reasons, to do with the unsuitability, if you like, of the infirmary as serving as a church. And they went to a lot of trouble to get planning permission, with a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of concern coming from English Heritage as was then about what they were going to put on the site. It had to go onto a place that was sterile, archaeologically sterile, so there was a small excavation there, but in fact, for reasons to do with what was known about the terrain, they didn't need major work there. And they built a new church. This is it in an unfinished state, which is the last time I was there in, I think, 2015. But it has been finished now. And so they have brought in what we would see as a modern imposition on a historic site, which purists would not like. They wouldn't approve of that kind of thing at all. As far as the friars themselves are concerned, however, this is totally appropriate. And indeed, if we go back to the Middle Ages, building a bigger and a better church was always seen as a good idea. It was a noble thing to do and worthy of much merit. But I think this is one of the interesting challenges here when we, if you like, we intersect our values here. We look at what is required by the local community. We look at aesthetically, and I don't like the new building, but then that's just me. We look at what aesthetically seems to me to be kind of jarring in our expectations of what the place should look like. We would look at, I suppose, people saying that the site is not suitable for a modern parish church because it is an ancient monument. Don't think that one holds any water at all, actually, because a very high proportion of parish churches in England are ancient monuments. So I don't think that really holds much water. But I think here we can see conflicting values in terms of what the place might resonate for, in terms of both visitors today and thinking about what went on there in the past. The second case study that I want to look at is the Gloucester Blackfriars. This is, again, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of being to the Gloucester Blackfriars. No, nobody's gone there. Right. Well, this is actually the second best preserved set of friary buildings, Blackfriars buildings in the country. But to look at them, and this is just one range, this is the south range, the dormitory range. You wouldn't necessarily think that that was an historic building of any great moment or note, well, would you? Yellow whitewash, little windows, obvious recent alterations at this end, or fairly recent alterations at this end, and some very scrappy looking windows along here, which we can see, which are part of the cloister, but a lot of evidence for insertions and rebuild. Now, this was actually much modified since the Reformation. And I think it's this bit here, which served also as part of a bottling plant in the 19th century. So it was converted for industrial use. I'll come back to that in a minute. But if you visit the site and you see this building, you then go inside it and you something completely different. And this actually has something that the site of Notre Dame de Paris no longer has. It has its original roof. This is a fantastic discovery. It was identified as the original roof, I think, in the 1950s, and there's been a lot of work done on the timbers, but also on piecing together how they were brought together. And here we can see the roof is of a style known as scissor braced. This is the dormitory. There's a similar roof, which we'll see in a second, not quite as well preserved on the site in the part of the church that's upstanding. Now, a detailed study by Oliver Rackham in the 1960s revealed that a range of carpentry techniques was used, demonstrating adaptive approaches to the available timber. So this is very much a building that is made in place and of place. But we also know from Crown records that several donations for the building of the friary complex, including the buildings in the cloister as well as the church, were made by Henry III. And we know that they were taken from 3 royal forests, Shipley, Dean, can't remember the third one, but anyhow, they're not all immediately proximate to the Blackfriars. Anyhow, Rackham calculated that the whole roofing complex, allowing for a bit of give and take, probably took over 200 oaks, a very substantial investment in building, chopping down over 200 oaks to make this timber complex. And these survive. And I say I don't think it was really appreciated until somebody actually had a good look at them relatively recently as to what it was that was surviving from the 13th century, the very first building here. Another feature that survives too is something that, if you think back to your student days, and some of you are still having them, think of your little study bedrooms in halls of residence. This is the dormitory, and if you see these little partitions, these divided the space into little study carrels for the friars to sleep, eat and read. As I'm sure that's what you do in your bedrooms. You never go out. You spend all your time working and in other virtuous pursuits. But anyhow, this is an amazing site to go and see, and I recommend that you do so. The church of the Blackfriars is also partly upstanding, and there's a very interesting story here with particular reference to the Reformation. Because what you see there, and we're looking towards the east end of the church, but this is actually a wall that's been inserted. The full range, the full length of the church, part of the east end has been knocked down. So that's actually a wall that went in there in the 16th century, wasn't one that was there before. And we can see there that it's got some lights. Your buildings archaeology skills coming out. You can all spot the windows. You've got a fine fireplace here and another fireplace here. There must have been a chimney coming up there, which you can see on the other side. And then we have a window there, which would have presumably giving access to the outside there, and something going on there, major blockage. But this here is again our 13th century scissor braced roof on the top. If you turn round to your right, you're looking into the north aisle of the church, and here you can see bits and pieces of original masonry. If you look at the bottom, you can see they're part of the pier arcades of the church. But there's been, again, an awful lot of blocking, bodging and codging of the apertures in the wall, which reflect its many changing uses since it was actually in use as a friary. Now, experiencing this as a place in the 21st century, you get the impression of, I wouldn't like to say a typical, but a very definitely, turned into a monument type place. Interestingly, it is now marketed as a wedding venue. If you go on the webpage and look at it, it's a scheduled ancient monument. They're all Grade 1 listed buildings, but in common with a lot of places, including our own Guildhall, first thing that you get, if you Google away, is that it's a very attractive place for your wedding. And you get exactly the same, actually, if you look at the Leicester Guildhall. That's the first thing that comes up. Marketing people are there to get in revenue. That's their job. The more people that make the hits, the sooner it gets to you quickly. So you're much less likely, looking for it on the web in a quick Google search, to find out about its historic interest. And indeed, its very remarkable story. At the Reformation, we see that it was modified greatly. Now, we do actually know who got the property at the Reformation, and we know quite a lot about him. And for me, I think it's very interesting to imagine or reimagine oneself as Thomas Bell, the man who acquired it, and what he thought he should do with the place. He was thrice mayor of Gloucester, and he was a member of Parliament, which at that time perhaps guaranteed a high degree of moral probity, maybe not so much now, but he was a capper by trade, and this is extremely lucrative. There was actually legislation passed in the middle of the 16th century saying that people had to wear caps, men had to wear caps. So everybody had to have a cap, and you were providing them. You had the opportunity to generate quite a lot of income. He was knighted in the 1540s, so remember he got the property in the autumn of 1538. He was knighted, but he had already been mayor of Gloucester. And his will and tombstone survive. Now, I've got a kind of a crude value judgment that I place on the status of people like this. If you actually have a portrait of yourself surviving, you've crossed a certain social threshold. Now, obviously, there are not a lot of portraits were destroyed, and we don't have them. If you were really important, you were lucky enough to be painted by Holbein, so much the good. If you weren't quite that important, a mere mayor and member of Parliament, having a painting made of you, and what survives may not necessarily be an original painting because they were retouched up and copied as well. You are of a certain degree, and it's quite interesting to think of some of the people who don't actually have portraits of themselves surviving at all. There's quite a good set of Reformation time portraits from Norwich, and certainly getting your portrait painted when you were a mayor seems to have been something that happened, but they're not. They're not, masterpieces. They're not works of prominent or eminent artists in themselves, but they're there to denote your status, your coat of arms, and all the rest. Now, this is the house that he built, and for me, it has always seemed extraordinary that he didn't actually choose the other ranges of the house. Maybe he thought they were a bit grotty. This is an engraving by William Stuckey in the early 18th century. But anyhow, it's very schematized because you've already had a look at this range, and it doesn't actually look in the least bit like that, does it? The windows are quite different, and it's a taller building too. In fact, the wonderful roof is not really evidenced on this plan at all. But this is the house that he built. And this is actually the east end of the church, the area of the east end of the church, which was demolished. But the main part of the church consists of basically the nave, with a little bit of the south aisle, or the north aisle here. Now this, it still looks like this if you go there. It's quite overgrown. It's got quite a lot of vegetation around it, but it clearly was maintained as a mansion. It was created as a mansion with a completely new set of windows, although the original buttresses of the wall survive. It's got chimneys, which you wouldn't find in a church, obviously. and this very nice formal garden and this little gateway, which is actually still there. What seems to me particularly remarkable about experiencing this place in the 16th century, as he started on this building a couple of years, possibly as soon as he got it, which was in 1539, he started on this building and he chose the church. Now, the church is a place of burial, and there were, and many other, there have been excavations that have identified burials inside the church. But he was quite happy to convert the main body of the church into a mansion for himself, and indeed his wife, Lady Bell. And one of the streets actually next to the priory site is called Lady Bell Gate, named after her, again showing the way that this 16th century man and his wife, they could, I was going to say inflict, they could impose their own namings on the environment in which they were in. But he could have, you would have thought, made use of one of the other ranges. He was clearly not in the least bit discomposed about the fact that he was building his mansion on top of the tombs of people who may well have known some of them, and certainly other people would have known them, and their ancestors would have been buried there. Now, this is one of the questions that I know Sarah has considered frequently. And I think well, she can say herself, I'm sure, but the idea is that actually people weren't all that bothered about that kind of thing. To me, it is nonetheless remarkable. I had assumed, before I started digging a bit more recently, that he was an ardent Protestant who was therefore, if you like, showing his enthusiasm for all things Reformed by making this very public act of changing the nature of what archaeologists are often very commonly called sacred space. He wasn't bothered about that. He was quite happy to turn it into a house. But in fact, he wasn't. He was actually of conservative religious beliefs and sought his religious solace among the non-radical survivors of the Henrician clergy. So that again makes me think, how does this engage with the grand narrative of the Reformation? What does it tell us? What can it tell us about the meaning of place, or meaning of this place, in terms of the big discourses and stories that are out there rolling around? So I want to end with just a few kind of retrospectives, which I hope people can think about themselves in relation to their own projects. Are we looking with a meta-narrative at a big story, and does place simply offer a sort of worm's eye view of what might be going on in a particular place? But I think we also need to consider challenging the way in which expert voices in those meta-narratives have fixed significance. They have decided what mattered in many ways, and they are prone to generalizations, which in turn can often be spotted as actually simplifications. And simplifications are not just because you have to say something to a 10-year-old. Simplifications may be actually reducing the value of what you're trying to convey when something is actually very complicated. That you can't actually oversimplify. You have to address the range of experience rather than the any kind of adding them all together and dividing them by the number of examples that you've got. I think the issue of taphonymies, what survives and what doesn't, in terms of what is valued within meta-narratives and what is valued at places, is a very important thing to consider. We need to imagine what is not there but would have been there, and we have to include that in any consideration that we want to make about our interpretations. I think I'm very sympathetic to the whole kind of phenomenological approach to places, because I think it simply makes you think in a different way, not simply measuring the widths of walls or the depths of post holes or the state of preservation of the wall paintings, which may all need to be in the record, but you do actually need to exert your imagination. And I think an imagination is a very important dimension and requirement of looking at archaeological projects in general. I end you with a little image, which one of many actually that you could find, particularly in East Anglia, which shows in some ways the focus of some of the Reformation activities, which are often misinterpreted. Now, this is what defacement actually involves. Throwing eggs at statues of Mrs. Thatcher isn't actually defacement. The statue was not defaced. But we can see here that this is what defacement actually involves. It's a font, a baptismal font. And baptismal fonts stayed in use because people continued to get baptized. So they didn't sort of chuck them out. They're quite hard to chuck out anyhow, heavy, large things. But also, you can see that a lot of investment has gone into these nice carvings which show different scenes. But a very pointed and precise activity happens. We see the removal of the heads, the faces of these statues to show that this was not an appropriate thing to have on a baptismal font. So I put here a powerful statement which I know is itself a sweeping generalization, but do places actually offer some kind of truth to power? Do they offer an alternative way of considering how power and agency is used? If we actually look at the interesting events and stories and particular features that can be spotted, it maybe takes us away from a meta-narrative and more towards a more complicated but a richer understanding of what might have been going on.
So much, Deirdre. So we've just been told that there is another room booking here outside now. So if it's all right, we'll take questions to the pub. And if anyone would like to leave comments or questions in the chat box, we will bring them with us as well. So yes, thank you so much for giving that talk, Deirdre. Thank you everyone for attending. That was fascinating.